Good evening, everyone. I'm PJ O'Neill, serving as Branch Chief for STEM Training and Youth Programs. Welcome to this month's Tech Talk, entitled Paddle Safe, Paddling Safety from the American Canoe Association. This is part one of a two-part series. Part two of Paddle Safe will be presented next month. Tech Talks are sponsored by the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary, and the Boy Scouts of America Sea Scout program. Tech Talks are held on the fourth Tuesday of the month at 2100 hours Eastern. And again, next month's Tech Talk will be part two of tonight's Paddle Safe, and that will be on Tuesday, May 28th. Just a reminder that this Tech Talk is being recorded and will be posted to both the Sea Scout and AuxScout YouTube channels. Please subscribe to the YouTube channels and share with your shipmates that could not join in live tonight. The recorded Tech Talks make for an excellent training opportunity in your Sea Scout ship or auxiliary flotilla. So please, again, like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the high-quality, on-demand training for you and your shipmates. You can enter your questions at any time into the Q&A, the questions and answers chat function. It's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And Dr. Pope will address the questions at the end of his presentation tonight. So I'd like to introduce our subject matter expert, Dr. Robin Pope. He's no stranger to the Tech Talks. He currently serves as the Deputy Director of the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary's Recreational Boating Safety Outreach Directorate. Dr. Pope has more than 3 decades of experience in paddling education. He holds the American Canoe Association's highest possible instructor ratings in both swiftwater rescue and whitewater kayaking, and was recently named a Legend of Paddling by the American Canoe Association. I'd like to now turn over safe paddling to Dr. Robin Pope.
Great. PJ, thank you very much for that introduction. It's always a little embarrassing hearing about yourself, but so tonight's presentation is going to be talking about paddling safety, and it's an evidence-based presentation. And the purpose for tonight's presentation, it kind of falls back on some data. The Coast Guard Strategic Plan for the National Recreational Boating Safety Program has 3 major initiatives, and Initiative 3 is to leverage recreational boating data. The last Tech Talk that I gave presented a lot of information about paddling fatalities, why they happen, what type of accidents happen, and then presented some evidence-based approaches that were intended to reduce boating fatalities. This really was an attempt to leverage the recreational boating data that's available and then use it to make boating safer. And one of the things you'll hear me say throughout this talk is that we look at safer boating not just to make it safer, but because safer boating is more fun. This presentation is, to the best of my knowledge, the first explicitly evidence-based boating safety course that's offered as a result of that data. And again, it's here to make paddling safer because safer paddling is more fun. It's important to think about using evidence-based content because if we look at the accidents that are happening, look at why they're happening, what leads to them, it's going to make the best possible course. Instead of being based on just my opinion or other expert opinion, it allows us to make sure that we catch the things that lead to problems and then create solutions to prevent those problems from happening. This presentation is available for free use by the boating and outdoor education community. It presents evidence-based risk management to help paddlers and other boaters have a safer time on the water. But anyone listening to it should recognize that all water-based sports have inherent risks and dangers. And if you're going to listen to this and use this information, we encourage you to take some hands-on in-water instruction from a qualified instructor and then make your own decisions about whether or not to paddle on any given venue. One of the things we'll cover in this talk is how to make those decisions so you can stay safe and have fun. This is not an official auxiliary or scouting course, but members of both organizations are welcome to use it. And other organizations can use this seminar so long as the ACA is recognized for its authorship and support of the course. One of the concepts with this is that it's been released when it's good rather than perfect. And we want to have it continue to evolve based on user feedback and then incorporate additional data. One of the things that I expect to incorporate in the next few months is a contrast between what happened before 2020 when we had the COVID pandemic, the height of the COVID pandemic, and then during the COVID pandemic, and then after the COVID pandemic, and see if things have changed. If you'd like to give feedback on this, my email is on here, and this file will be placed into the Google Drive that's up here. I tried to get it in before the presentation, and I wouldn't be able to use the internet to give this presentation if I was trying to do that now. Things are a little slow at my house, but that will be loaded in the next day or so. So in the presentation, I'm going to give some background information, talk about some commonly reported paddling accidents and their causes, look at some interventions to prevent them from happening, and then interventions to respond once they happen, because no matter how much we try to prevent problems, we know that they will eventually happen, and it's not just enough to prevent them. We have to be able to respond afterwards. And then we'll give a wrap up, but we won't get to that today. That'll be next time. So we want to start with some definitions, and a boat is the first thing, and we're all boaters, we should know this, but it's really any vessel that's intended to carry people or goods in the water, and that can be propelled by motors, sails, paddles, oars, or all sorts of other things. For the purposes of this talk, it's important to remember that some devices that float are not boats. So inner tubes are not considered boats. Some types of floating waders that anglers will use are not considered boats. A human-propelled boat is anyone that's propelled solely by human power. And we're going to define paddlecraft as ones that are defined by a paddle. Paddles can be one or two bladed, for example, with a canoe or a kayak. Many of them have a shaft to hold on, but some can strap directly to your hands. And pedal drive kayaks would also be considered a paddlecraft. Oar-rigged whitewater rafts are commonly used on big water, whitewater streams, particularly out west. And even though they're not technically paddlecraft, we often think about them as paddlecraft. They have some of the same risk factors that we deal with. If you look at the data, they're not very involved in accidents. So whether or not we include them wouldn't affect any of the statistics, but the risks that they deal with are similar to other paddlecraft. The definition that I think it's important for any paddler to recognize is that a motorized craft is any vessel that's propelled by a motor, and that can be a gasoline-powered motor, a diesel motor, or more recently, we're seeing lots of electric motors. If you put an electric motor on a human-propelled craft, that is now a motorized vessel, and depending on your state, you may have different rules that affect your boat. All boaters are responsible for knowing and following the laws and regulations that affect their boat. So it's important to remember that if you put a motor on your human-propelled vessel, it might not be a paddlecraft or another human-propelled vessel. It might be a motorized vessel. So a little bit of background. Why are we bothering with this presentation? Let's give a little data. In the United States, paddling appears to be enjoyed by more than 35 million people each year. There's a huge paddling community out there. The data suggests that paddlers make up about 40% of the recreational boating community, and nearly 2/3 of the growth in the recreational boating community each year. So there are lots of paddlers out there. From a perspective of a boater, paddling is a great way to get on the water. It's lots of fun. It's something that I and 35 million other people enjoy each year. But as boating educators and boating safety professionals, knowing what's going on with craft that are making up nearly 2/3 of the growth in boating each year is important for us. So it's fun, but there are also some hazards we want to be able to address. If we look at the data, nearly all paddlers have a safe and enjoyable time on the water. And that's a take-home message I want everybody to get. We hear about tragedies with paddlers, but most people who get on the water have a great time and don't end up in the bad statistics. Unfortunately, a few hundred every year, a few hundred out of that 35 million, don't have a great experience. They're involved in a significant accident or they have a fatality. So knowing how to deal with these tragedies helps us stay safer and have more fun. Because of the rules about which boating accidents are reported, Most of the reported paddling accidents are fatal. The federal rules state that a complete loss of a vessel needs to be reported. Medical care that's beyond first aid needs to be reported, and fatalities need to be reported. And there are a few other things. There's good data that shows that many accidents are not reported, and we know from paddling that that's very much true. Speaking to paddlers, there are many that don't realize that they need to report accidents. But once a fatality occurs, law enforcement gets involved, and they're much more likely to report those. So that affects the data that we have. Recognizing that, though, the steps that are going to prevent fatal accidents are almost certainly going to prevent other accidents. So we're going to use the data we have, but recognize that it's almost certainly going to be much more widespread than the data that we have. And if you stop listening right now, the take-home message I want you to get is that staying afloat, staying upright, and staying in your boat are keys to paddling safety. It's really hard to drown when your head's above water. And if we look at the data, 87% of paddling deaths are due to drowning. So staying in your boat, unlike the gentleman we see here, staying upright, unlike the gentleman you see here, and keeping your head above water, which this gentleman is doing, and that's what saved his life and allowed him to be put into a rescue situation just a few seconds after he capsized. So we also know that 71% of paddlers who died on the water were not wearing a life jacket. And you can't see this gentleman's life jacket, but he was wearing one. And that's what allowed him to stay heads up while he was going through the outwash on a rapid. We know that 85% of paddling deaths were associated with capsizing, falling overboard, or otherwise unexpectedly entering the water, which is just what the person here did. And what we know from that is that nearly all paddling deaths are preventable. Another factor we learn when we look at the data is that when the education status is known, and that's only known in about half of paddling deaths, but when we know it, more than 90% of paddlers involved in fatalities had no boating education of any kind, and that includes informal education. When we talk about informal education, that means that PJ and I go out and I give him some information or he gives me some information. It's not a formal class, but one of us is teaching the other. The people that are dying don't even have that level of education. They certainly aren't getting involved in formal classes. So we know that simple paddling education most likely saves lives. And that's what we're doing right now. We're giving some paddling education. When we look at the contributing factors for paddling accidents, hazardous waters are the leading factor, responsible for about a quarter of the fatal accidents. Hazardous waters, when we say that, people often think about small craft advisories or class 5 rapids, and certainly those are hazardous. But when we look at the definition the Coast Guard uses, it's really just water that's a little bit more challenging than your skill level. 1 foot chop, 18 inches of chop, 15 knots of wind, faster currents. Those are all things that experienced boaters don't even pay attention to. It's not a hazard. But if you're a new, inexperienced boater with no education, 1 or 2 foot choppy wave is no longer fun. That's what makes you capsize. A wake from a powerboat going by is what makes you capsize. Just some irregular current can make you capsize. Another reason you're likely to capsize is because you're inexperienced. You don't know how to handle those hazardous waters, and that's a responsibility for about 15% of paddling deaths. Alcohol consumption, 13% of boating deaths, or of paddling deaths. It's the number 3 cause of deaths, the number 1 contributing factor when we look at all boating out there. So if you're going to go to the water, we tell people to drive to the water sober, paddle sober, and go home sober. It's not just enough to say we're going to wait until we get off the water. Drive home sober. And we certainly want to make sure that people are following rules about this. If you're an auxiliary member or a scout, this should be obvious. We're not going to drink alcohol. But there are other boaters that are doing that, and there are an unfortunate number of accident reports where we see that alcohol was a major factor. Another thing that will cause problems is improper loading and overloading, putting too much in the boat or putting it in a place where the boat is off balance. And if the boat is overloaded or off balance, it's likely to capsize and you end in the water. Bad weather is the last one we'll talk about, and that's 7% of fatal boating accidents. Bad weather, again, might be horrible thunderstorms and hurricanes coming through, but it also might just be a little bit more wind than you expect. We recommend that inexperienced paddlers stay away from winds that are greater than 10 knots. If I go to the beach, there are plenty of days where there are 15, 20, 25 knot winds. And if you're not prepared for that, you don't anticipate that, we can have a bad time. So the typical paddling accident, if you look through all of the accident reports, and I've recently read through every human-propelled boating accident report between 2014 and 2022, this is what we see. The typical fatality is an inexperienced boater who often is alone. They enter the water due to poor boat handling, and that might be due to hazardous current, or excuse me, hazardous waters or bad weather, or just inexperience. Once they get in the water, they're not wearing a life jacket. Big thing that we want to do is wear life jackets. And because they're an inexperienced boater, they don't know how to self-rescue. That self-rescue might be getting back in the boat, it might be holding onto the boat and signaling for help, it might be swimming to shore. Whatever is appropriate for that situation, they don't know what to do. They make a bad decision, and as a result, they drown. 1 in 7 paddling deaths, alcohol or drugs consumption is associated, which makes it even harder to stay upright in hazardous conditions. And the take-home message here is that there are all sorts of steps we can do to prevent the typical fatal paddling accident. The last presentation I did talking about trends in recreational boating deaths went through a number of effective interventions, and I'm just going to put these slides up. We're not going to read through them. They're all going to make sense, and we're going to go through all these points in a moment. So how do we manage paddling accidents? How do we prevent them? How do we respond? Number of steps that we can use. And the first is trip planning. Trip planning is important for paddling. It's important for other types of boating. In the auxiliary, we use risk management, used to be called the GAR score. We use that to assess our risk and plan our trip and make sure that we stay safe on the water. There are lots of other approaches, and I'll talk about a general approach. The boating statistics don't talk about how to get to the water, but it's really hard to boat if your boat never makes it to the water. So we'll talk briefly about that. We'll talk about dressing to swim, recognizing hazards, handling your boat, and ways to get the experience and training to do that. And then we'll talk about, in our next presentation, some priorities and principles for rescue, principles or techniques for self-rescue and techniques for helping others, and then how to seek outside help. So we start with the big thing, planning your trip. And we start with the idea that failing to plan is planning to fail. If you don't have a plan, you don't know if you're following your plan because there's nothing to follow, you end up in trouble. So trip planning helps us anticipate, prepare, and prevent problems. We know that well-planned trips are safer and more fun. Well-planned trips have a proper lunch break. They make sure that there are good water breaks. There's a place to get out and go to the bathroom. There's time set aside for whatever fun thing is involved with that trip, whether it's looking at a waterfall or exercising to prepare for other trips or surfing or just enjoying the scenery. Make sure when you have a well-planned trip that you get to enjoy those fun things. It takes some effort, but it's worth the time. And really, the Scout motto of be prepared sums up the reasoning for solid trip planning. If we're prepared for what we're going to experience, we have a better time. So when you plan a trip, there are a lot of things to look at. The first thing is, what about your group? What kind of knowledge do they have? What kind of skills and abilities and equipment? So if all you have are whitewater kayaks, going on a long sea kayaking trip is probably not going to be fun. If all you have are recreational kayaks, going on a challenging whitewater trip might not be fun. So we need to look at the equipment that we have. We want to look at our skills and abilities. If you're inexperienced, we go easier. If you're more experienced, you might look at more challenging things. Think about the type of trip that you want. and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But there are lots of things you can do on paddling trips, and it's best if the group is all on the same page. If I want to do something and Bruce wants to do something and PJ wants to do something and they're all different, we're probably not going to have as much fun on the trip. We want to think about how far you can travel. There are people that do short half-hour trips, and that's what they have fun with. There are people that do multi-day expeditions in other continents. If you're going to do a short day trip, that requires a different level of planning than if you're going to travel to Bhutan and do a 2-week expedition. So how far can you travel for your trip? And how long do you want to paddle? Again, a multi-day expedition is much different in planning than a short trip. And then we think about the hazards where we're going. There are all sorts of things that we can do to find those hazards. You can see the group here looking at a chart to figure out where they want to go. There are guidebooks, there are all sorts of online resources, and just starting to search for the potential hazards of your destination will help you manage them. And making some plans. It might be when we get to a certain point on a river, we're going to get out in portage. It might be that as you're making a channel crossing, you're going to wait for slack tide so you don't have to worry about tidal currents. It might be looking at ferry traffic on a path that you're going to make sure that you're not trying to go through an area at the same time that a ferry or a commercial barge is. But doing that planning in advance helps you understand how to handle those challenges. So I said you want to talk to your group, and the first question is, do you have a group? We really want to have a paddling group of at least 3 people and 2 boats. If you don't have a group, you shouldn't paddle. Paddling alone puts you at much higher risk, creates all sorts of challenges. Having groups of 5 or 6 are large enough to handle most emergencies, but small enough to stay together. And my experience has been that when you get into groups of 10 and 20, they'll break up into groups of 5 or 6, but it's easy for somebody to get left out when you do that. So they end up, even though they're officially part of a group of 20, nobody else is looking out for them. Having a buddy, making sure that you stay with your group, and having a group big enough to handle the issues that might come up will make you have more fun. We want to assess, as we look at our paddling trips, what are your personal paddling abilities and your group's abilities? Again, think about the equipment that you have, and is that equipment in good working order? The only way to know that is to check. My preference is that you check before you leave on the paddling trip, because if you get to this point where you're about to get on the water and you find that your gear is missing or broken, then it's not going to be a good day. And actually on this trip, one of the people showed up and needed some extra thermal protection that they didn't have. So having that checklist, going back and make sure you have everything, makes you have more fun. I said it helps if your group is on the same page. We think about how far we want to travel, and recognize that if you do a circle or do a loop trip where you paddle out to a destination and then come back to your starting point, that's an easier logistic planning than something where you start at one point and end up at another. Consider when you want to paddle. If you want to paddle in January, that's a different matter than if you want to paddle in July. Right now, it's the spring. People like to paddle. It's starting to get warm. Where I live in Western North Carolina, it got up to about 85 degrees today, which seems like a great place to paddle, except the water temperatures were still about 45 degrees. So if you're not prepared for that, you have a miserable experience. And really asking yourself, do you have the knowledge, skill, ability, and equipment to address the conditions you're likely to encounter? And if you don't, then paddle another time and location. The water is always going to be there. Make sure that you are too. To choose a destination, after you've made all these thoughts, come up with a few options. Consider some of the legal issues you're going to have to address. Parking might be an issue. There might be permits required. And we will think about emergency access. By addressing these issues before we get on the water, it helps make sure that you avoid some unpleasant encounters that we really don't want to have. I don't want to deal with an angry landowner, and I don't want to deal with an angry law enforcement officer. So making sure we take care of these legal issues beforehand prevents those problems. Consider your logistics. How much food, how much water do you need? Do you have communications? Do you have any other needed equipment? And then make your decision about where you're going and how you'll get there. Having said that, be flexible. Have a backup plan, thinking about what happens if the anticipated situation changes. The weather conditions that you expect might not, or that you see at the water, might not match the forecast. Water conditions might change due to rain and storms or to the lack of rain and storms. I did a class several years ago where the first sign that we might have a problem was the warning sign by the road that said, "Warning, road may flood," had about 3 feet of water over the base of it. And we definitely changed our plans that day. There might be special events that create access issues. There may be a river festival that's going on. There may be a festival unrelated to the river, but it's using the parking for the water area. There may be a concert on the beach or a wedding on the beach that affects your ability to access that. So be flexible. And when the situation changes, change your plan. This is prepared for the American Canoe Association, and really we emphasize alcohol is just something we need to avoid on the water. So what type of equipment does every paddler need? If you're going to paddle a boat, you need a boat. And if you're going to paddle, you need a paddle. You need swimming gear. And I like to think about swimming gear rather than saying life jackets or other specific things, because it really puts us into a big picture. The first thing you need for your swimming gear is a life jacket, but you also need thermal protection to protect you from cold and heat and provide some sun protection. And I really emphasize closed-toed shoes whenever we're boating. The closed-toed shoes help protect your feet in the boat, but they also help protect your feet if you're out of the boat. If you're sea kayaking and you have to walk across all sorts of sharp seashells or the bed of oyster bed, you want to have those closed-toed shoes. If I'm in trouble and you have to run down the bank of the river to get me, you want closed-toed shoes, and I really want you to have closed-toed shoes so that you can run when you need to. We need food and water, rescue and first aid equipment, and some communication tools. And where you go determines what you might use, but every paddler should have a whistle that's attached to their life jacket that allows them to signal if they need to. Make a checklist, lay out all your gear before you get on the water, and take a moment to make sure that you have everything you need. Every paddler I know, every whitewater paddler has a checklist, and it's their hand. I've got 5 things I have to have. I need a boat. I need a paddle. I'm a whitewater kayaker, so I need a spray skirt. I need a helmet, and I need a life jacket. So if I don't have those 5 things, I can't boat. I might be able to be flexible about some other things, but without those 5, there's no paddling for me. So come up with your checklist, make sure you've got what you need. One of the things you do need is a communication tool. And as I said, every paddler should have a whistle attached to their life jacket. Paddlers typically use 2 whistle signals. One is just a short blast to get attention. It's essentially, hey, look at me. And once you look at me, I can point to where I want you to see things, or I can wave at you, tell you I need help. We can use all sorts of signals. 3 prolonged blasts, particularly 3 blasts that are repeated, are a kind of universal signal for help or an emergency. Paddlers don't necessarily use the same signals as powerboats. And if you look at the navigation rules, there are a few things that we should understand. 3 prolonged blasts for a paddler often means help. If it's a powerboat, it means I'm planning to move sternward. You'll often hear that right before they come off a pier. Doesn't mean they're in trouble. It means they're going to back over you, so be careful. Powerboats, large vessels might use 5 short blasts, and they might use 1 or 2 short blasts to tell what they're planning to do around you. So as a boater, it's important to understand how paddlers communicate, but also how other boats communicate. So how do paddlers communicate other than whistle signals? We can use our paddle. And so a paddle held vertically parallel to the water surface, just held overhead, just means stop. And that's like a red light on the traffic signal. Doesn't mean there's an emergency, it just means you need to stop. If it's held vertically, pointing straight up, that's a green light, means come on ahead. If I hold the paddle but I point it to one side, that means go over to that one side. And we always point in the direction we want you to go. If I hold a paddle upright and circle it or wave it back and forth, that's an emergency. And it's helpful to know what to do in an emergency. So one of the briefings that I will use when I teach paddling is what happens in an emergency. Do I want the group to go to a particular site? Do I want them all to rush down and help whoever's in trouble? There are times when both steps are appropriate, but we want to know that in advance. The final thing is patting yourself on the head, and that can be a question and answer. So if I pat myself on the head and then point at someone, I'm asking, are you okay? And if they pat their head, yes, that tells me they're good. If they look at me with big bug eyes, that tells me I should probably go to them. And if you look at the American Whitewater site, they have some information on that and some drawings. Paddlers are boaters, and all boaters have to follow some traffic rules. The complete rules that we have to follow are found in the navigation rules, and also state and local rules that you have to follow. From our perspective, there are a couple big things. One is assume that motorized vessels, power boats, don't see us and will not stop or change course to avoid collision. So regardless of what the rules say, we want to take action as paddlers to avoid those conflicts with other boats. And one of the best ways to avoid those conflicts is stay out of the places where those other boats are. We try to avoid channels where larger vessels are operating, particularly operating at speed. And if we have to cross a channel, we do so as a group after we look to make sure we're not going to impact other vessels. There aren't traffic signals, or rather, there aren't many traffic signals on the water, but we want to think about the buoys that we see out there. And red buoys, hopefully everybody knows, are on the right side of the channel as you're heading inland. The idea of red right returning. Green buoys are on the right side of the channel as you head out to sea. And then white buoys are warning buoys. If you're not familiar with buoy signals, you can see more at the website that's shown here. Red and green are easy, but sometimes people forget about warning buoys. So if you see a white buoy with a diamond on it, that's some type of hazard alert. If you see it with a circle, that tells you that there's some type of restricted operation, a no wake zone. Most kayakers, most canoeists are not able to create a wake, so that's not a big deal. A diamond with a cross in it is an exclusion zone, and that means that you just don't go into that area. And then a square is information, and the examples they've got here are gas dock and boat ramps. If you're operating in low visibility, we do want to make sure that other boaters know where we are. And paddlers should blow a whistle or a horn once every 2 minutes, just to let other boaters know where they are if they're in fog. If you're operating at night, you have to have a bright white light that can be deployed in time to prevent collision. Reading through accident reports, there are lots of paddlers who have been run over by power boats in the middle of the night because they didn't have a bright white light or they didn't deploy it in time. So thinking about preventing problems, it might be better to just stay off the water during these periods of low visibility. I've paddled at night a few times, and you feel very small, very fast on a very big, dark body of water. Staying on shore might be the best approach. Some more legal issues. Boat registration. Most human-propelled boats don't need to be registered, but you're responsible for knowing your local rules. Once you put a motor on it, as I said earlier, it's important that you know whether or not that boat needs to be registered, because you put yourself at risk of getting a ticket or having other problems if you don't. Another thing we want to think about are exclusion areas, when we should not go in. So the general rule of thumb is do not approach within 100 yards of military or law enforcement vessels unless they tell you otherwise. If the police officer tells you to come to them, you should go to them. If the Coast Guard vessel tells you to come to them, you should go to them. Follow the specific directions given to you by law enforcement vessels. We want to try to avoid going within 500 yards of any military or law enforcement vessel because we don't want to interact with them. They've got other things they need to do. And if you do have to come within 500 yards because you're in a channel that's only 400 yards wide, just giving them a quick heads up on channel 16 if you've got a VHF radio, that's a common courtesy that might make things go smoother for you. So we talked about trip planning, talked about some of the legal issues that we might have to deal with, talked about how to choose a trip, but we got to get to the water. So getting to the water, accidents that are happening as people go to and from the water aren't tracked by the Coast Guard or by anybody that I'm aware of, but they certainly happen. Big thing we want to do is make sure that you properly secure your boat to your vehicle so it doesn't come off. I've had friends where boats have come off while they're driving. It's just not a good day. Boats are heavy. So one of the first things to think about is asking for help to get the boat up over your head. If you drop a boat, particularly off of a roof rack, you can damage the boat, you can damage vehicles, you can hurt people. Lifting boats overhead can strain yourself. So don't start your trip with a broken side mirror or a torn rotator cuff. Get some help if you need it. When you're paddling, when you're going to the water, the picture here is an example of a properly secured boat. So I've got straps going across the middle of the boat, securely attaching it to the roof racks. There's a stern line that's going down to the bumper and a bow line that's also going to the front bumper. So this boat is secured by the bow and stern line to the car and then secured by the straps to the roof racks, which are secured to the car. That 4-point security provides a really strong hold of the boat onto the car, makes it very unlikely that it's going to come off. Even so, every time you stop the vehicle, you want to check and make sure that things have not loosened up a little bit. And then if you want to add even more security, using a chain or a cable lock can make sure that the boat is more difficult to steal and less likely to come off the roof. So we've gotten to the water safely. We're going to get in the water, and we need to think about dressing to swim because paddlers are swimmers who periodically sit in boats. As a paddler, I need to be prepared to swim. Being able to swim is an important part, but it's not the only part of being prepared to swim. So make sure that you're wearing a life jacket. Life jackets are like seat belts in a car. You have to wear them for them to work. And I've met boaters who say, oh, I'll put the life jacket on once I get in the water. I encourage you to try and do that in a swimming pool with a lifeguard watching. And your fellow scouts, your fellow auxiliary members can be entertained by filming this, something to show at a Christmas party. It's really tough to put a life jacket on in the water. And that's in a safe, controlled condition. If you're in the water and you're cold or you're injured or you've just sucked in some water because you capsized unexpectedly, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting that life jacket on. So wearing it in advance is just like having a seatbelt in a car. And we're going to stop here. So life jackets are the first step in dressing to swim. Next time, we're going to start talking about cold water problems and how to prevent cold water problems as part of preventing issues. Thanks very much, and I will be happy to answer some questions. And I'm going to stop sharing now.
Well, thank you very much, Robin. Such a rich presentation, and so many individual parts could easily be used for standalone training.
Oh gosh, yes.
It's definitely one to rewatch to focus in on all the details. Here's one question. So what should we do? Say we're paddling with a group and we come upon a stranded vessel or an unmanned vessel like a kayak, wasn't part of our group, and we look around and we don't see anyone there. What would you recommend?
That's a tough situation, and it's one that unfortunately does happen. If you find a kayak, well, let's say, for example, if you find an adrift 20-foot powerboat or sailboat, somebody's upset about this. They don't just go adrift. But somebody who is paddling a kayak or canoe or stand-up paddleboard and forgets to bring it up over the water line when tide is going in and out, or has it close to shore and the wind blows and it gets knocked into the water, it's pretty easy to get boats into the water. So, in terms of helping prevent the issue you've described, using an if found sticker, putting it in the boat so that we can call you if I find the boat. And I know lots of paddlers who don't use a sticker, they just use a magic marker and write their name, their phone number, and their email address in the boat. So, hopefully, someone has done that and you can call and say, "Hey, I found your boat. What do you want me to do with it?" Um, and if the person who answers says, "What are you talking about? My friend is out paddling. Um, where are they?" Then you know that you need to move to the next step, which is going to be contacting your local authority. On open water, that might be the Coast Guard. On inland waters, that might be law enforcement. In general, if you're using a VHF radio, it's pick up, go on to channel 16 and call Mayday. And if you are inland, then picking up the phone and calling 911. Um, I would say that this is really similar to being on shore. If you are on shore and you're hiking and you find a mountain bike that's wrapped around a tree, you're going to look for the person that was on that mountain bike. In the water, you can look for the person and hopefully save them if there is a problem.
Yeah, good advice. Sometimes the if found stickers are hard to come by, so the permanent marker is a great idea.
Yeah. Remember that the marker will wear off. You need to refresh it periodically.
Great. Something about the communications. Your slide on the various paddle signals and where to tap your helmet or where to hold a paddle. First, that seems like it would be a great training evolution for the off season that you could do on shore at a meeting to
Yeah.
practice with your
Mhm.
paddling group.
Yes.
But it may make me think, you had mentioned that it's more typical in on coastal areas to have a marine VHF radio.
Yes.
How about more inland trips when you're a group and you mentioned, say, a group of 20 that might break off? Um, is is it advisable or common to use, say, a walkie-talkie for intra-group communication, or is that problematic? Are there better ways to communicate with your group?
It depends on the venue. And I'm primarily a whitewater paddler. We see that you lose line of sight very quickly. You've got lots of interference from mountains and trees around you. But for short range communication, a waterproof walkie-talkie works great. Um, if everybody has a VHF radio inland, even though people don't commonly use them, there's certainly no reason they can't use them. I do know people that use cell phones frequently, but same problem. If you're down in a gorge, you don't have any signal. So electronic devices seem to not be used by inland paddlers as much. And that means you've got to be more heads up with what the group around you is doing and with your paddle signals.
That would seem to imply that it's a good idea to practice with your group so that everyone is familiar and on the same page.
Yes, absolutely. I have a friend that was teaching a class, and to make sure that everyone knew the paddle signals, he had us do a warm up and held the paddle up for a stop, and then basically played Simon Says and used the paddle to get people to move wherever they wanted to. So you got some motion, you had fun, and you learned the paddle signals.
Great. I do want to come back to the beginning of your presentation. You're really making a point about education being key.
Yes.
And I think many of us in the auxiliary and Sea Scouts dedicated to recreational boating safety, we're aware that some training is better than no training.
Absolutely.
And of course, the American Canoe Association offers, many levels of training from novice to advanced. But that said, is all training the same, right? Or of same value? Say you're at Bass Pro Shop and they're going to have a kayaking workshop. Is that sufficient if I'm brand new to paddling, do you think?
Um, any training is better than no training. And entry level training is entry level training. I think if you're being taught to put on a life jacket, to wear the life jacket all the time when you're paddling, and if you learn a little bit about how to manage the boat, and I start managing the boat with how do you load the boat, how do you get in and out, how do you do basic paddle strokes, and how do you do basic rescues, whether that's hold on to your boat or swim to shore. I think that no, the all training is not equal. Good training is better than bad training, and I'm not sure bad is the right word. Highly experienced and efficient training is better than less experienced, less efficient training. But I think whatever training you get, the data shows that a little bit of training goes a long way.
Yeah, it seems simplistic, but I was really blown away by the statistic provided that 71% of the paddlecraft fatalities were from not wearing a life jacket.
Yeah, we save more than 2/3 of the fatalities just by mandating life jacket wear. And that's why the Coast Guard and the auxiliary require life jacket wear. That's why Sea Scouts and Boy Scouts require. It's why the American Canoe Association requires it for all of our programs. It's and we all drove. Most of us drove today. I put a seatbelt on, and part of it is because I'm required to, but part of it is because in high school physics, we calculated the kinetic energy that you would have if you were in a car crash and you weren't wearing a seatbelt, and how far that would throw your body. And as somebody who likes data, that was data that made me say, yeah, I'm going to wear a seatbelt from now on.
So this last question, it would probably be hard to derive an answer from data, so probably more your experience and your opinion. Um, but of course, when you talk about lack of education in the paddlecraft community, it's an easily accessible water pastime. You don't have
Yes,
to spend tens of thousands of dollars you would on a motorboat. So
right.
you could go into any big box store and pick out a kayak based on color or a canoe or whatever. Um, so what do you think the factor in vessel type with inexperienced boaters might play in terms of safety?
Yeah. So if you look at the data, the average, and with canoes and stand-up paddleboards, it's hard to evaluate it. But when we look at kayaks, which are the most common paddlecraft, short kayaks tend to be whitewater kayaks. Long kayaks tend to be sea kayaks and touring vessels. And then kayaks that are kind of mid-range tend to be recreational vessels that don't have the support and strength and are less expensive. Um, and so if you're looking at fatalities between um, not wearing, or excuse me, between 9 and 11 feet, those are more likely to be recreational kayaks. And the average length of a kayak that's involved in fatality is 10 feet. So it is those vessels that somebody goes down to Tractor Supply or to Walmart, Dick's, and gets the recreational vessel from a store that doesn't just sell paddling craft. If you go to a paddling shop, it's hard to get out without getting the safety equipment, without getting a notice. Hey, this club is offering a free class, or come to our day and we'll teach you some basics. Tough to get out of the door without a little bit of education, that informal education that might be enough to save your life.
Yeah,
Um,
good advice.
I'd be remiss though if I didn't give a plug for the American Canoe Association's free online paddling course. If you just Google American Canoe Association, look under education, and then look for free online course. It's a free 30-minute course that provides some life-saving education. It's done in a cartoon format. It's easy to watch. It's got really solid things, and it's free and it's short. So every person that's interested in paddling, every person that buys a recreational kayak should take advantage of that.
Yeah, simple advice. And there's a comment in the webinar chat that I think just drives that simple point home from the chat. You inhale a lungful of water when you fall in, and if you're wearing a life
Mhm.
jacket, you fall in, and your head does not submerge, you don't inhale the water. It seems so basic, but clearly, uh, the message the
Mhm.
message is still has to get spread, and we
Yeah.
have to emphasize with every year each new class of paddlecraft operator,
Yeah.
um, to get training and to understand the basic principles of on water safety.
Yeah. As I said at the beginning, it's tough to drown when your head's above water, and life jackets will keep your head above water
Right.
most of the time.
So I think we can all remember staying afloat, staying upright, and staying in your boat. Right. Those
Yep.
those are the keys.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think I speak on behalf of all of us that we're looking forward to having you back on May 28th for part two of Paddle Safe. Thank you very much, Dr. Pope, for sharing your research with us. Excellent presentation, and this will be for sure a valued training material across the Sea Scout and auxiliary.
Yep. Thank you. And I look forward to next month.
All right. So everyone, we hope that we see you back here on May 28th. Spread the word and have a good evening.
Good night.
Good night.